At Fredericksburg, there was an exchange across the Rappahannock. One of them hollered, "Hey, Reb." I said, "Yeah? When are you fellas going to come over?" I said, "When we get good and ready. What do you want?" He said, "Want Fredericksburg. Don't you wish you may get it?" And things like that. There were a lot of those exchanges.
A line of hills overlooked Fredericksburg, Virginia, a key Confederate transportation link midway between Richmond and Washington. Union General Ambrose E. Burnside's plan had been to cross the Rappahannock by pontoon, occupy the town, then take the thinly defended heights. Bold action did not come naturally to Ambrose Burnside, though he had led his men to Fredericksburg, determined to display the fighting spirit his predecessor George McClellan had so conspicuously lacked. But now the War Department failed him, and 17 days passed waiting for pontoon bridges to arrive. By the time the bridge was in place, Lee had 75,000 men waiting in the hills. Stonewall Jackson was on the right, James Longstreet on the left, along a bluff called Marie's Heights. From the top of the heights, Lee could just see Chatham Mansion across the river on the Union side, where 30 years before he had quartered his wife, Mary Custis. It was now Burnside's headquarters. On December 11th, Union guns began shelling Fredericksburg, setting much of the town on fire. Then the troops started across the river. Some wondered why the Confederates did not make it harder for them to cross. "They want to get us in," one private said. "Getting out won't be quite so smart and easy." While waiting to attack the heights, Union men looted what was left of the town. The Great Assault came 2 days later on December 13th. Federal forces advanced toward Marie's Heights. Lee could not believe the enemy would be so foolish. His artillery covered all the approaches. 4 lines of riflemen waited behind a stone wall that ran along the base of the hill. General and officer assured James Longstreet, "A chicken could not live in that field when we open on it."
How beautifully they came on. Their bright bayonets glistening in the sunlight made the line look like a huge serpent of blue and steel. We could see our shells bursting in their ranks, making great gaps, but on they came as though they would go straight through us and over us. Now we gave them canister, and that staggered them. A few more paces onward, and the Georgians in the road below us rose up and let loose a storm of lead into the faces of the advancing brigade.
The brilliant assault of their Irish brigade was beyond description. We forgot they were fighting us, and cheer after cheer at their fearlessness went up along our lines. General George Pickett.
It was suicide. They came forward, one man said, as though they were breasting a storm of rain and sleet. Faces and bodies half turned to the storm, shoulders shrugged. The Irish brigade got within 25 paces of the wall. The men of the 24th Georgia who shot them down were Irish too. A Union officer watching from a church steeple saw brigade after brigade charge the stone wall. They seemed to melt, he said, like snow coming down on warm ground.
They still believed that to take a position, you massed your men and moved up and gave them the bayonet. Well, there were practically no bayonet wounds in the Civil War, much more than there were in the First World War or the Second. They never came in that kind of contact, or at least very seldom came in that kind of contact. But they still thought that to mass their fire, they had to mass their men. So they lined up and marched up toward an entrenched line and got blown away.
14 assaults were beaten back from Marye's Heights before Burnside decided it could not be taken. 9,000 men fell before the Confederate guns.
More credit for valor is given to Confederate soldiers. They're supposed to have had more elan and dash. Actually, I know of no braver men in either army than the Union troops at Fredericksburg, which is a serious defeat. But to keep charging that wall at the foot of Marye's Heights after all the failures they've been, and they were all failures, is a singular instance of valor.
Watching from above, even Robert E. Lee was moved. It is well, he said, that war is so terrible. We should grow too fond of it. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine were among the thousands of Union men pinned down at the foot of the heights. That night, the temperature fell below freezing and a stiff wind blew. Men now froze as well as bled to death. Night brought quiet.
But out of that silence rose new sounds more appalling still, a strange ventriloquism of which you could not locate the source. A smothered moan, as if 1,000 discords were flowing together into a keynote, weird, unearthly, terrible to hear and bear, yet startling with its nearness. The writhing concord broken by cries for help, some begging for a drop of water, some calling on God for pity, and some on friendly hands to finish what the enemy had so horribly begun. Some with delirious, dreamy voices, murmuring loved names as if the dearest were bending over them. And underneath, all the time, the deep bass note from closed lips, too hopeless or too heroic to articulate their agony. At last, outwearied and depressed, I moved 2 dead men a little and lay down between them, making a pillow of the breast of a third. Drew the flap of his overcoat over my face and tried to sleep. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.
They were stuck there all night and all the next day, crouching behind a wall of their own dead, trying not to hear the Confederate bullets thudding into the corpses of their friends. Burnside, openly weeping, declared that he himself would lead the new attack. Subordinates talked him out of it. That night, Chamberlain and his men scraped out shallow graves for the dead. As they worked, the northern lights began to dance in the winter sky.
Who would not pass on as they did, dead for their country's life, and lighted to burial by the meteor splendors of their native sky?
It was very unusual to see the northern lights that far south, but the whole heavens were lit up with streamers of fire and whatever the northern lights are. And the Confederates took it as a sign that God Almighty himself was celebrating a Confederate victory.
The slaughter is terrible, the result disastrous. Until we have good generals, it is useless to fight battles.
The Union had lost 12,600 men. The South had lost 5,300 men. But many of them were only missing, gone home for Christmas. The battered Union Army limped back across the river. Icy rain began to fall. From the ruins of Fredericksburg, Confederate soldiers openly taunted the Union troops huddled miserably on the far side of the Rappahannock.
After the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Confederates went back into the town and they saw all the damage that had been done during the Union occupation of the town. It was a great deal of damage, real vandalism. And they were shocked, and someone on Jackson's staff said, "How are we going to put an end to all this kind of thing?" And Jackson said, "Kill them all."
General, I have placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. I have heard, in such a way as to believe it, of your recently saying that both the Army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of this, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up as dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. Abraham Lincoln.
Again, Lincoln turned to a new general. He replaced Burnside with Joseph Hooker, a tenacious West Pointer called Fighting Joe, who drank and talked too much for his own good. It was absolutely necessary, Lincoln told him, to destroy Lee's army.
My plans are perfect. May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none.
Hooker's plans called for one part of his enormous army to feign an assault on Lee's front, still at Fredericksburg, while the rest marched up the Rappahannock, crossed the river, and attacked Lee from the rear. On April 30th, Hooker's main force, 70,000 strong, reached Chancellorsville, a lone house in a clearing surrounded by a thick forest called the Wilderness. Hooker and his officers moved in downstairs and continued to map out the assault they were sure would trap Lee.
The enemy must either ingloriously fly or come out from behind his defenses and give us battle upon our own ground, where certain destruction awaits him. The hen is the wisest of all the animal creation, because she never cackles until after the egg is laid.
But Robert E. Lee, outnumbered nearly 2-1, was not fooled by Hooker's plan. Defying all military convention, he divided his own much smaller force, leaving only a quarter of his men at Fredericksburg before rushing west to shore up his flank. When Lee's Confederates reached the edge of the Wilderness, Union troops moved out to engage them. The fighting had hardly begun when Fighting Joe Hooker inexplicably ordered his forces back to defensive positions around the Chancellor House. To tell the truth, he later tried to explain, I just lost confidence in Joe Hooker. Lee sensed Hooker's confusion, and the next day divided his army a second time, sending 28,000 men under Stonewall Jackson on an extraordinary 14-mile march through the dense wilderness and around the Union's right flank. Hooker somehow persuaded himself that Jackson was actually retreating, and despite the skeletal rebel force remaining in front of him, chose to stay in camp. All day long came reports from terrified Union pickets of a huge rebel force moving just beyond the screen of trees to the west. They were ignored. Late that afternoon, Union troops were boiling coffee and playing cards when deer came bounding out of the forest and through their camp. Jackson's army was right behind them. It was a perfect whirlwind of men, a survivor said. The enemy seemed to come from every direction. The Federals fell back nearly 2 miles before darkness stopped the Confederate sweep.
Chancellorsville, in many ways, is Lee's masterpiece. It's where the odds were longest. It's where he took the greatest risk in dividing his army in the presence of a superior enemy and kept the pressure on. The real fault at Chancellorsville was the attack was staged so late in the day that they were not able to push it to the extent that Jackson had intended to. And he was even attempting to make a night attack, a very rare thing in the Civil War, because he knew that he hadn't finished up what he'd started to begin.
Eager to fight on, Jackson rode out between the lines that evening to scout for a night attack. When he turned back toward his men, nervous Confederate pickets opened fire. 2 of his aides fell dead. Jackson was hit twice in the left arm. His shattered arm was amputated the next morning. Lee was horrified. "He has lost his left arm," he said, "but I have lost my right." Hooker continued to bumble. As he nervously watched the fighting from the porch of the Chancellor House, a shell split the pillar he was leaning against and knocked him senseless. Groggy all day, he refused to relinquish command. Finally, he ordered retreat. The defeat was total. Again, the Union Army withdrew across the Rappahannock. Hooker had lost 17,000 men, even more than at Fredericksburg. My God, said Lincoln when he got the news. What will the country say? Chancellorsville was Lee's most brilliant victory, and one of the costliest. 13,000 of his men were dead or out of action. But it was the loss of one man that concerned him most. Stonewall Jackson seemed to be recuperating. Then on Sunday, May 10th, he took a turn for the worse.
The scene is in a bedroom in which he's coming in and out of consciousness. Pneumonia is what he died of, not the loss of his arm. And his wife got there to be with him. And the surgeon, Dr. McGuire, told Miss Jackson that her husband would die that day. And she told him, said, the doctor says that you won't last the day out. And he said, oh no, my child, it's not that serious. And then finally she said, you will be with the Lord this day. And he went off into some sort of sleepy delirium. Pneumonia affects people in strange ways. And he called the doctor and says, Dr. McGuire, my wife tells me I'm going to die today. Is that true? And the doctor said, yes, it is. And he said, good, very good. I always wanted to die on a Sunday. And when they offered him brandy or morphine, he said, no, I want to keep my mind clear. And the last thing he said is sort of, he wandered in his mind. He was calling on A.P. Hill, prepare for action. And then all of a sudden he was quiet, very quiet for a spell. And he said in a clear, distinct voice, let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees, and then died.